Good morning. My name is Lori Grenia, and I'm one of the co-presidents with HR Answers. Our firm does a number of activities associated with harassment. We're a freestanding HR shop for hire. We support attorneys in their preparation for litigation, as well as do we write policies and investigate harassment claims. My experience in harassment is about 15 years deep. It started in government investigations and continues forward now with both government and the private industry.
My name is Haley Morrison. I'm a partner in the Labor and Employment Department at Tonkon Torp. We do litigation and advice and counsel for a number of different employers of all size. We do all employment defense work. Our clients are concentrated mostly on the West Coast, and because I started my career in California, I also have a robust California practice.
Hi, my name is Roxana Justin with the Partners Group Commercial Insurance Division. The Partners Group is one of the largest benefits brokers in the Northwest with over 150 employees. My background includes extensive work in employment practices, risk management solutions, as well as over 10 years of experience in commercial insurance. A couple of our services include commercial insurance, risk management, employee benefits, analytics and wellness programs, wealth management, retirement plan consulting, as well as personal insurance for individuals.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Linda Baker, the editor of Oregon Business Magazine, and I want to welcome you all here today to our Employee Liability Practice Seminar. Today's topic really doesn't need much of an introduction. It seems like every day we hear a story in the news about another executive who has been toppled by sexual harassment allegations, another company that is facing workplace misconduct lawsuits. And in fact, like clockwork, this morning I woke up, opened up my Twitter feed to discover that the CEO of Oregon's largest employer, Intel, was forced to resign yesterday, I believe it was yesterday or this morning, as a result of apparently a consensual past relationship that took place sometime in the past. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one who opened up her Twitter feed this morning to read that news, and that hundreds, probably thousands of HR managers and executives read the story and thought, are we next? So we are here today to talk about how companies, how businesses can protect themselves against the risk of workplace misconduct and what steps companies can take should a lawsuit come to pass. We've got a great group of panelists here who can provide tips and insights on those issues. Before we get going, let me just tell you a little bit about the format. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we will have a moderated discussion for about 45 minutes, and after that I'll open up the discussion to audience questions. So you can write down questions as they come up, and you'll have a chance to enter into the conversation in about 45 minutes. So I want to thank you again for being here this morning, and without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. To my immediate right here is Roxana Justin, who works with the Commercial Insurance Division with the Partners Group. Roxana has an extensive background in employment practices, risk management solutions, with more than 10 years of experience in the insurance industry. She specializes in offering her clients employment practice risk management solutions through an unconventional approach of total cost of risk evaluation. So welcome, Roxana.
Thank you.
Next to Roxana is Haley Morrison, who is a partner with Tonkon Torp. She's a partner in the firm's Labor and Employment Practice Group, and Haley provides counsel to employers on a wide variety of matters, including discrimination, retaliation, harassment, and wage and hour cases in both single plaintiff and class action litigation. Welcome, Haley.
Thank you.
And to my far right here is Lori Grenia. Lori is the co-president of HR Answers. and she brings 15 plus years of experience, knowledge, and understanding of compensation work and human resource management for all sizes of government agencies. Lori has extensive experience working with executive management and staff in group settings and one-on-one meetings to explain, exchange information or facilitate discussions. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's kick off the discussion. And I think really to sort of set the stage here, I think it's interesting to ask, why is this conversation taking place now? And why has the conversation reached such a fever pitch? The issue of workplace misconduct and sexual harassment has been on the radar for companies for a long time, certainly since I entered the workforce, and yes, that was a long time ago. And it seems like the issue sort of comes back, hits the news every 5 or 10 years, and each time the conversation intensifies. But what we're bearing witness to now, I think, is really unprecedented. So what's happening? What is the confluence of factors that has led us to this moment?
So I think one thing, and you mentioned it already to start with, is our access to information is different than what it's ever been before. I opened my Facebook in bed this morning. I looked at my LinkedIn in bed this morning before I got up, and many of us do that. We are fed information constantly. Caution, huge note of caution. Good information, bad information, misinformation. But we are fed information constantly. We can also find it whenever we want to, wherever we want to. That access has significantly changed, I think, any form of potential litigation, as well as people being informed. Again, sometimes misinformed. But that and the fact, and Judy, one of my coworkers, mentioned this morning as we were talking about this, I think our unemployment instance is also pushing this a little bit because people know they can go someplace else and see different treatment. And frequently they like what they're doing. They want to work for your organization, and they are willing to risk it because they know they can go somewhere else, where before they may not have been able to find another job, so they chose to sit quiet.
And to piggyback off that, I think the Me Too movement has just completely snowballed. So more and more complaints are coming in, and not only the Me Too movement, but the LBGT stuff is also coming in. Stuff is the worst word ever. That's all that's coming to mind. So those two things are huge topics right now in every organization, and I think everybody's just trying to figure out, well, what do we do? How do we prevent this? And I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not a matter of if a claim will come in, but when.
All right, so technology, the unemployment rate, the Me Too movement, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's both of those things, and then also the reality of our workplace now, which is that women aren't generally standing alone. In most work environments, you're not going to be the only woman there, or the only minority there, or the only older person there. So with the Me Too movement, others in the workplace, there's more of a community, and it's more of a banding together than perhaps we've seen in previous generations.
And that sort of leads us into our next question about what is most encouraging about this cultural shift. Obviously, businesses are right to be concerned, and as you say, it's not a matter of if, it's when, and we're going to get into what companies should do to protect themselves. But before that, let's keep looking at this from sort of a 30,000 foot view. What is encouraging about this cultural shift on the part of for companies?
I think one of the things that's most encouraging in this is that employers understand the expectation of their employees. So looking at it from that perspective, it's easier to set an atmosphere where people are comfortable, where they can thrive, where they feel protected and taken care of. As a female in the workplace, I am happy about that for a lot of different reasons. Fair pay, more opportunities for other people. I really do think that right now we're reaching a fever pitch, but I think once these ideas and topics become more of our commonplace conversation, it's easier to fix environments that have otherwise been hostile to female employees or other minorities that employers may not have even known about. That information may not be getting to the appropriate people, to owners, to managers, to HR people, when there wasn't the same open dialogue. And now that there's more of a dialogue, they're able to fix those problems before you start losing good employees.
So transparency in general is just a healthy move in the right direction.
From an underwriting perspective, just being able to show the underwriter the steps you've done to either improve the organization overall if there was a claim, or preventative measures if there hasn't been a claim, will only help your case as far as driving premium costs down.
All right.
I think the only thing I would add to that is from the perspective that over time, what is acceptable for any of us has changed. And there are certainly things that have hit me on occasion, and I go, I cannot believe I'm actually having this discussion with somebody. And my most recent one is gender specificity. Really, I'm having a discussion about the fact that you don't want to claim male or female, and yes, I have to change the entire collective bargaining agreement to not use those references anymore. 20 years ago, people would have thought you were nuts if you would have said, yeah, you need to do this. And so there were things we just didn't talk about, because whether either a moral standard or a personal standard or just industry standard was, you don't talk about that stuff. That has to change. It has to be an open discussion so that people not only are comfortable having the discussion, but they're also understanding what's acceptable and that we all have differences.
And kind of piggybacking on that notion, taking this from the other perspective, I have a lot of clients that are concerned that they're creating an environment where everything has to be so PC, so sterile, that they can never possibly keep up with the demands of their workplace. That concern certainly has come to light a lot, and it is a valid concern. You can't moderate everybody's behavior beyond the standards of the law. But what it does do is if they see that the company cares, if they see the employer cares, it's easier to have those conversations even when the conversation is, I understand your concern, you're being overly sensitive, I'm not going to moderate that discussion, get back to work. Once they know the employer cares about the environment generally, even those conversations are easier because the little things don't add up as drop in a bucket.
So can you provide additional examples of measures or tactics that would sort of navigate that divide between transparency and caring and an environment that, as you say, is sort of excessively too PC on the other hand?
From my own personal perspective and in dealing with the clients that I have, I think the most important thing is for employees to be heard, even if you come to a different conclusion than they wish that you did. Training helps a lot. This is what the law says. This is what our policy is, even if it's more restrictive than the law, meaning that we control more behaviors than the law would otherwise police. This is how our work environment is. That kind of training is very, very helpful. And then being able to have an open dialogue. So if somebody comes to me and says, I'm very offended about this thing, you can say, okay, I understand that as a particular sensitivity to you. It's not something that as a company we're going to invest a lot of time or energy in, but please feel free to talk to me about it. You always have an open door. And that ability to be heard, even if your concern ultimately doesn't land with an investigation or somebody being fired or the result that the employee wants, sometimes that's enough, just to know that they have been heard and that they are cared about.
All right.
And I would add to that I think it starts with, most organizations have a culture, whether you know it or not. And my emphasis here is you should know what your company's culture is. You should have been purposeful in determining what that is. Management has a role and responsibility associated with modeling that. And we have all heard the phrase, you have an open door policy. If you've got something, come talk to me about it. And whether that's your HR shop or your managers, is the door really open? Because I think that's one of the concerns that we run into, which is every time I go by, I just wanted to drop in for a couple seconds and say, hey, this is feeling weird to me, or I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with this. But if the manager's never there, or not accessible, or HR is never there, or not accessible, then we run into they're stewing on it, they're thinking about it, it's growing in severity for them. Maybe in reality, maybe in perception, but it's still gotten worse. So how do we line up those things? And management has to have a clear responsibility for that. I also think employees have a responsibility when you observe those types of things. We were talking earlier. I firmly believe that it's okay for an employee when they pass the water cooler and hear something that Not sure everybody would be okay with that you can stick your head in and say, hey guys, that seems a little off color, and keep moving. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out conversation, but it's just an acceptable statement that, hey, maybe not everybody's going to like that. Move on. And again, I totally agree, you cannot PC everything. It's not possible. And those differences are what make our organizations unique and fun to be in, and the things we value about each other. But the reality is, you still have to know what your culture is. And if you think you know it, you don't have enough information yet. You should know it.
Not to steal Lori's story, but earlier she told us about an employee that thought they were being harassed because a coworker brought in cupcakes. That's not something you're going to police in the workplace.
But we investigated it.
Yeah, the ability to come to somebody and say, I think this person is trying to sabotage my weight loss goals. Okay, we're not going to do anything about that.
And that was the case.
But I understand, and I'm sorry that you feel that way, but, you know, we're going to allow cupcakes here. Sometimes you just have to have that conversation so that person is not spinning out of control about something that really is not ultimately a big deal.
Diffuse the situation.
Right.
All right. So you have to know your culture, but at the same time, you need to have an actual policy in place around workplace misconduct and sexual harassment. So let's talk about what should go into that formal policy. What's most overlooked, in fact, when companies are assessing a risk of harassment and developing harassment policies?
So I think two things that I would suggest in that one are that everybody is responsible for this. It's not just a management exercise. Every employee needs to engage, and your policies should talk about the fact that everybody's a reporter. If there's something going on that you've observed or that you've experienced, you report it. You find the right person. And that right person can be many different people, so keep it open. Because if the person they're concerned about is their upline, and your policy says the upline is the only person they can report to, that's going to be a problem. You've stopped them from being able to do this because your policy is too restrictive. So think big when you talk about this, and please give some examples. Again, if you're familiar with what your organization's culture is and what would work for you guys, and thank you for your example, managing cupcakes is probably not going to be something, but some people think you should. That's their opinion, that's okay, but what has the organization decided? And if you know what those are, write them down. It's okay, give them some information to chew on for a while.
It's also beneficial to have multiple lines to file a complaint, multiple people to file a complaint with if they don't feel comfortable going to HR, maybe a director or somebody else, or online or an email, you know, that you can reach out to is important, because not a lot of people feel comfortable necessarily walking over to HR and having that conversation. And then the second thing, as far as policy verbiage, is make sure that it's not worded in a way where people aren't going to understand it. If you have a bunch of young people in your organization, you want to make sure that they're understanding the expectations.
I would agree with both of those. I think it's very helpful to define what harassment and discrimination are under the law, as well as the kind of conduct that won't be tolerated by the company. And those two things overlap in large part, but they could also have, there could be more things the company won't tolerate that aren't going to qualify under the law. So set those expectations. With regard to reporting, it is very important that you don't just have one person to report to for the reasons that were explained here. If my manager is harassing me and my only option is to go to my manager, there's a good argument there that there's no way that I'm ever going to find out or ever going to report it, then the company never finds out until I sue. But it's also very important to define who those people are. So I always counsel my clients, do not say any manager or any supervisor. It needs to be people that are trained to recognize and deal with these kinds of complaints. But at least two avenues. So HR and the CEO, or your manager or HR. But it needs to be directed enough that these complaints aren't happening to peers, that are not happening to lower level supervisors that aren't trained to handle it. Because if a complaint is made to them pursuant to the policy, and that person doesn't know what to do with it, so they don't go to HR, they don't go up their appropriate chain, now the company is on notice. As a matter of law, the company is on notice about this and decided not to do anything or did not act appropriately. So you lose the value of the complaint in the first place.
And your insurance might not cover you at that point.
Very important.
The only thing I would tack on to that is don't forget complaints do not have to be in writing.
Right.
We review a number of handbooks in our organization. I cannot tell you how many times we have to strike that language out of their policy. They're making an attempt to have a policy, and I do appreciate that. But we really, really need people to, any way that they're comfortable, that they can bring information forward. If for you, you need to get it in writing and you've received something yourself, feel free to write it out for them and send it back to them and say, did I capture our discussion accurately? That's a great thing, and I promise your attorneys are going to want something in writing anyway. So, but it doesn't have to come to you in that form. So don't constrain them for how they get there.
The other thing that's really important is not to promise confidentiality.
Yes.
This is one of the ways that the reporting mechanism goes completely awry. You say, report it to your supervisor or any supervisor, and then somebody that has a relationship with their supervisor goes and says, dear friend, this is happening to me, please, 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 please don't tell HR. And the person that's not appropriately trained doesn't. And then that information again is known by the company and it hasn't been told. So what we say is, will be kept confidential to the extent possible, consistent with the appropriate investigation. And then those people that are the reporters need to be trained. It doesn't matter if they beg, plead, do not want you to tell. You have to tell them you cannot keep their confidence and you have to report it. And that is an obligation of a manager. They have to be able to follow through with that.
So what if a manager suspects someone is being harassed, but that person has actually not complained?
So this is an interesting question, because in prior experience, we would have said if they haven't complained, then let it go. As a company, your defensible position is post-complaint, right? Now with this new movement, with Me Too, and with the workplace having more open dialogue, I would actually give the opposite advice. And I would say you're better off knowing, and you're better off having somebody that is trusted go talk to that employee. Even if you find out it's about cupcakes and not about something we need to take care of, we are better off as companies and as employers knowing what's going on with our employees so that we can be proactive, stop it early, even if in the course of litigation, otherwise, you would be able to say, here's my complete defense, they never complained. That still remains true. But let's not get there. Let's not get to litigation in order to find out there was something we should have taken care of. Like I said earlier, employees like to be heard. So talk to them, find out if there's an issue. If there is, it might be a broader issue within the workplace environment that is just not making its way up to management that should be taken care of proactively.
I don't think this is a whole lot different than when supervisors get the call from the employee that they're not going to be in that day. What's going on? Is there something I can help you with? Or somebody that you see coming in tardy and that hasn't been their practice before. Something's different. It's okay to ask, hey, I've noticed. Everything okay? Ask the question. Give the opening for them. They may just need to get jump started, and that's okay, because they may be tied up in their head on, is this just me being too sensitive, or something else? And you want to stop it before we get to visit either of these ladies.
You don't want to see us coming.
Yeah, I mean, even if there is a scenario similar to this one, I would highly recommend getting your insurance agent involved just to have the conversation. There's no hurt in putting the insurance carrier on notice. They're, at the very least, just have the information in case it does develop into a claim.
All right. So we heard about the cupcakes intervention. Can you give us an example of another real-life example from your company or from a company you've consulted for that sort of illustrates puts these principles into practice?
I think the littlest is something like what I talked about with the water cooler. It's okay to stop it when it's small, and I promise it's the best place to stop it. And so even if that's in a staff meeting and everybody's just having a conversation about what's going on and there's a little off-color comment or any of those types of things, it's okay after the meeting to pull somebody aside and say, hey, just wanted to say, not sure that was the best thing, probably don't want to cover that again. Others may have, or I saw somebody's face or their eyes go down, those types of things, because the observance of this is really important, that we're paying attention to what that is. So it's the practicality of being comfortable enough to say something. We do an incredible amount of work around difficult discussions. How do you have difficult discussions? Well, it's only difficult if you let it become that. So don't get there. These are everyday occurrences that lead to a little bit was okay, so why is more not okay? So if you stop it when it's still a little bit, we're much more likely to be successful and avoid bigger issues.
I would echo that completely. I saw this case hit the docket about 6 months ago, and the blurb went something like, class action for harassment. Several examples included male employees diving under desks to look up skirts, hair being pulled, all this kind of behavior that you say, and this was a very big company with sophisticated executive team and HR and everything else. You say, how does it get to a place where somebody's diving under a desk in a meeting to look up a skirt with enough witnesses around that it becomes a case? And it's the lack of boundaries that just keep getting pushed. And as people, we are all toddlers at heart. We need boundaries. And I think it starts with nipping things in the bud when they are small and saying that's not appropriate for this workplace before you are addressing the person that is desk diving. And I have a lot of clients that are very sophisticated. They like to have a very fun work environment, people to be friendly, to go out with drinks with coworkers. And that is wonderful as long as the expectations are set. And a few of my clients in particular the last few years, they had this very collegial environment. Things had gotten out of control. And what ended up happening is I had to go in and do about 6 months worth of training to get things back on track, because it had wound up to a point where HR was ineffective. Management was getting constant complaints of harassment. They were firing people left and right because it had gotten so out of control. So you have to bring it back in, which is much harder to do than to nip it in the first place. So when you do get to a place where you realize your environment is off kilter, training is really helpful. And we were talking about this earlier. A DVD is fine, a webinar is fine, having an outside person come in, but it is so helpful to have an HR person or an executive attend those trainings and show how important it actually is. To bring things back to an appropriate level, we do a lot of role playing, practicing some of these better behaviors, and then the business actually has to put their money where the mouth is. And if somebody is violating the training we just gave, which happens every single time, that person needs to be dealt with swiftly and appropriately, so that people realize that this is a serious change. The atmosphere has changed.
And it's important for the directors and owners to be a part of that training and that conversation, so you lead by example. Quite honestly, employees aren't going to want to follow anything that you're telling them to do if they're not doing it.
So Haley, you raise an interesting point about sort of the simultaneous but diverging trends we're seeing take place in the workplace, because on the one hand, the workplace is becoming less formal, and that's driven in large part, I think, by younger workers, by millennial workers. It's driven by the virtual workplace, technology. So on the one hand, we have the more casual workplace environments and a breakdown of hierarchy between managers and workers. And on the other hand, we have growing concerns around workplace misconduct and sexual harassment. And as I say, these trends seem to be simultaneous, but they're also sort of going in different directions. And then there is the issue of a multi-generational workforce and how different generations view the issue of workplace misconduct very differently. As I said earlier, this is an issue that I've been hearing about for decades, but my understanding and take on the issue is probably very different from somebody who's 20 years younger than I am. So that's a mouthful, but I'm curious to know if you how you think companies can again navigate maybe these two trends, the casual workplace on the other and the workforce, the workplace misconduct on the other, and then maybe also if you have any comment on the multi-generational perspective and how companies can address those issues.
Sure. I think it's a very multifaceted approach, and no, there's not going to be one size fits all. How wonderful is it to have our employees be friends and to have a sort of a flattening of the hierarchy where an employee that is a new recent college grad can talk to a senior manager friendly and in an environment where everybody is cohesive and happy. That leads to long-term success. But it does also create some of these problems where is the line? If we go out for beers after work with our managers and then tomorrow we're getting a review by the same manager, how does that interact? And that's tough. It is a problem that we're seeing now, really kind of for the first time in this generation with the millennials. But on the other hand, we also have more open dialogue than in the past. We have people that are being trained and expected to speak up when something makes them uncomfortable. Many of you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that in these kind of work environments with a more flattened hierarchy, or at least a more collegial hierarchy, that the millennial that is being called sweetie is going to say, "Don't call me sweetie." That is a very positive thing because you are kind of bridging the gap between the generations just by the nature of the personalities at play and the workplace becoming more cohesive. So we do see people speaking up more. It is ushered in by some of the Me Too movement and the idea that you have people that are multi-generational with very diverse point of views feeling more free to speak up. And to the extent we can encourage that in our workplaces as a cultural norm. Like Lori said, the bystander speaking up when something is inappropriate. Being able to report to a friend or a colleague that maybe is a little bit tougher and saying, "Hey, so-and-so keeps calling me derisive names, can you help me?" That kind of communication within the environment is very helpful. Lay that on top of training about what's acceptable and what's not, the expectation that the company is going to help you facilitate those conversations. All of that, I think, leads to better dialogue and then ultimately a better work environment.
Do either of you have anything to add on the multi-generational perspective or?
Nope.
No?
I
Okay.
think the only thing I would add to that is every generation has been different. Whether you want to label it millennial or anything else, I don't care. They're going to have different values, different perspectives, so on and so forth, and that's what keeps us moving forward. Even those of us who've been in the workforce for a number of years have to look at, how am I going to sell this to a different group of people tomorrow? How am I going to, all of those things have always been part of every successful organization. It's not bad, it's just a different way of looking at things. For years, and when I first started in HR, there was this thing called work-life balance. You mean an 80-hour work week is not the thing? Guess what? We've been successful in that. And people actually want to spend time at home, but they also want to spend time with the friends that they have at work because they are still spending numbers of hours with those individuals. But there's a balance in between there, and I think balance is the key, and however you want to define balance is up to you, and that's different for everybody. But yeah, does that mean you might go out to the bar with your coworkers at any level of the organization? Sure, but there is a bright line on if whatever's happening at the bar is impacting work, and it falls into any of the legally defined roles behind harassment, we have a problem. So keep the line clear. I have gone out with my employees before. I have a very bright line for myself. I don't drink with my employees, but I do go out to dinner with them. I don't have any issue with that. But they know I have a role and responsibility at the office. I can also be your friend. That's okay, but be clean on the lines.
I remember the phrase work-life balance.
Yeah, I don't like it, but it's a thing.
But you're right, it's interesting. Already that phrase seems a little bit outdated. Now it's more life. Life reshapes it, right?
Well, I actually think we can kind of thank the millennials for some of that. I've seen enough of these programs with the differences between the generations to understand that part of what is making the millennial generation so successful in their innovation and the way that they're approaching life is that there's not a line between work and life. It is, I'm going to go out, and surf at lunch and then decide to log back in at 8 o'clock. That works for some work environments and it doesn't work for others. But I go down to Silicon Valley. I have a lot of clients down there that are in tech. My favorite one has a 23-year-old CEO that's a total genius. But when he's talking to me, I'm like, what are you, it's just a totally different world, the way that they approach things. but he's so much happier because they have this integration of work and life that allows him to do the things that he wants to do. And I think we're going to see more of that across all industries, as an expectation that work is going to enhance my life is going to enhance my work, and there's not such a dividing line between them.
All right. So I think we touched on this a little bit, but what's considered harassment that most people would be surprised by?
We talked about this earlier, but third parties, so your vendors, your customers, anybody that walks on your premises is also subject to harassment and can file a claim.
So that's your UPS person. It's the invited customer onto your premises or out to a social event. It is the people that you invite to your workplace, celebrations, all of those people that are invited into the work environment. If they are harassing your employees, you are on the hook for those people. You have a responsibility to protect your employees.
And vice versa, if your employees are harassing the UPS guy, you can be on the hook. And your employment practices policy does not automatically include that. So you have to make sure you're checking to see if third-party coverage is there.
As well as does your policy need to call that out? You need to make sure that language is there, because I've certainly had the call where the receptionist finally went into HR and said, I cannot take any more of this delivery driver because of his comments, do you want to go out for a beer? Do you want to, how nice you look today in a not very polite way? Those types of things, they happen all the time. And somebody has to be able to say something about it, number one, but I think it's pretty easy with the receptionist. Frequently they're out there by themselves and there aren't necessarily a lot of people around them. And so it happens. The other one that we run into outside of that are those activities that happened outside of work. So this is why I say clear, bright line about what's going on, because all the team, maybe no supervisors were involved, went out to the bar after work, and one teammate's interested in another teammate and can't take no for an answer. And then back in the office, you now have somebody who is not able to get their work done, who's unable to focus. I mean, all of those things, they can have an impact. And I've heard person after person contact us and ask the question after getting some facts, saying, but it didn't happen at work, so it's not a thing. No, it is a thing. You do need to deal with that. And those are hard discussions, because you are definitely then entering that land of, we're crossing over into what people think is their private life. But when we included work in it, you've opened the door for the discussion.
In terms of substantive areas of the law that people don't typically think of, most people would think about race, age, gender, sexual orientation as becoming more prominent. But there's other areas like religion, military status, family leave. One of the most interesting cases I had recently was a client. This kind of bridges the gap of what we were talking about, but I had a client that was sending employees out to see one of their clients. So they serviced other companies, and their employees went out to this other client, and the client wanted to pray before their meetings, and one of our employees said, I don't believe in praying, and stepped out. And they lost the business as a result of that decision. So the company was in this place where they've got somebody who has lost business as a result of their religious or lack thereof choices. They needed to protect that employee because that customer then started deriding them about the fact that they didn't believe in God, and lost the business at the same time. So there is a lot of different factors that can play into that, but that employee had every right to decide not to pray, and that company needed to stand by that employee's decision, smooth it over with the client, and then tell the client, hey, guess what? You don't get to talk to them about that anymore. If they want to step back politely, they get to step back politely. They're tough decisions, they're tough conversations, but they really are. It's so multifaceted in so many different areas of our lives.
All right, so we have time for just a couple more questions, and then I will open up the discussion to your questions. What do you do if the managers or the executives of the company you're working for respond? Let's see, how shall I phrase this? I think what we're hearing in the media certainly is that there's a little bit of a backlash taking place in some companies, and their people are saying, we've got a witch hunt going on and I don't want to participate. Is that something that you have encountered? And again, what what should companies do to bring people who are just rebelling against the current cultural climate?
You know, I think one of the things that I try and encourage employers with, or that our organization spends a lot of time talking about, is you make a choice about where you work. And when we get through those discussions around, we've investigated something, we have an outcome, but for quid pro quo, we might end up not terminating someone. They might still be there, and that still makes the other person really uncomfortable. They haven't figured that out yet. You have to help them through that, through all of those emotions that are going on with that. Supervisors still struggle, always will struggle, because there is no magic wand when you sign on the dotted line that I'm going to be a manager, that you know all this stuff. It doesn't happen, I promise. I made that transition. It didn't happen. I happened to be in HR. I still didn't have all the tools I needed. Okay? So the reality is you have a responsibility to step in and help people be successful. Give them resources. Give them resources outside of your organization. EAPs are usually a really great one, if you've got one. They usually have a manager call-in line, and they can just say, hey, I'm a manager. This is the situation we're dealing with. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with that. And they can have that discussion and get some grounding on that. And it doesn't have to be them going to the HR person that they perceive to be either higher than them or lower than them and saying, I don't know. That's a hard place for them to be. Because supposedly managers know everything, right? The employees at least think that. Or they think they know nothing. I mean, I think the reality is when we deal with the situations, they have a life after the situation's instant effect. It will continue in the organization in some way, and whether that's the person's gone and everybody really liked that person, they may have been really good at what they did, they just made a poor decision, and they have to leave because of that decision. I have actually a case that I worked on where retaliation became the issue. After the fact. They did everything the way they were supposed to. It was reported, they checked in on it, they found out what it was, and they fired the good manager as far as everybody else was concerned. And then it became that individual was repeatedly teased, so on and so forth, about the fact that, well, you got the good manager fired. You got, so on and so forth. Now we can't do the fun stuff that we used to do because you complained. It's retaliation. Mm-hmm. Those are those ongoing things that you have to manage in the environment.
Mm-hmm. I actually have very limited tolerance for those complaints about the witch hunt and now we have to behave a certain way. Good behavior was the same last year as it is this year. And if people are having to change their behavior because people are talking about it now, I'm so sorry for you. Take a time out, you'll be okay. I mean, it bothers me because I don't really think that our standards of behavior have changed. Mm-hmm. It's just that we're talking about it more. Mm-hmm. Where I do understand but don't necessarily sympathize with managers or other people in a higher position that are feeling like they can't take on mentorship responsibilities because of why is he taking her out to dinner? Why are they spending so much time alone? Those kinds of conversations. Mm-hmm. But they're really easy to fix in a way that isn't to the detriment of the employee that's being mentored. An example of that is you hear all the time on the news. This is the Mike Pence problem, right? I don't go out to dinner with women unless my wife is there. Fine, bring your wife. I mean, really, it's an easy solution. If you are a manager and you are a different gender or a different whatever the uncomfortableness is, say, hey, would you like to go out to dinner? Feel free to bring your spouse. Feel free to bring a client. Bring a friend. Why don't two of us go? Why don't you bring one of your colleagues that I don't know very well that I might like to meet? Mm-hmm. Don't have a one-on-one situation if that's going to be a potential problem. But don't stop mentoring and being a responsible manager as a result of that. So there's really easy workarounds. Mm-hmm. Other than that, I just say, I'm sorry that your behavior is being pointed out. It's going to have to change.
All right, thank you. Do you think 5 years ago the CEO of Intel would have been forced to resign over a consensual relationship that had happened in the past?
I think in their particular instance, yes, mm-hmm. Because Intel has long had a standing policy that you're not allowed to have relationships, mm-hmm. consensual or otherwise, mm-hmm. with subordinate staff. Mm-hmm. And anyone is subordinate to the CEO. Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. the reality is, yes, I think that would have occurred. And I think that's also really important to understand. As you talked about, there is a legal definition behind this, but every organization gets to decide whether they're going to step beyond the legal requirement. There is no legal requirement to ban all relationships in your organization, but Intel chose to do that. He chose to work for them, and when he chose to have the relationship, he had the potential to lose his job, period. They found out, he lost his job.
By the way, those are good policies. You don't want to have people in a relationship, consensual or otherwise, that are at a different power structure. That's asking for trouble. It's really hard to tell our people what they can and can't do in their private lives, but there is always a choice. If a CEO wants to have a relationship with somebody that is within their hierarchy, they can leave. They can get a new job and date all they want. But this is a policy, and it's there for a reason. It really does protect what can be a really terrible situation.
And I think in counterbalance to that a little bit, I don't believe that you should make your employees sign love policies, and yes, they exist, just Google it. And some of them are really scary, but the reality is humans have a fundamental need for love. And people experience that in different ways, and people that you spend a significant amount of time with, your employment situation may develop into something like that. You do have to be able to balance out then can I continue working here, and they're making a choice. And I think that's really important for all of us to remember. I'm not forced to work at HR Answers. I chose to work for HR Answers. They offered me a job and I took it. I love my job, so it makes it a little easier. But the reality is we all make choices, and those choices are continual. Employment is not a finality. If you don't like the circumstance of the policies for that organization, please look for someplace else to be. Because I promise you, there are many different types of organizations out there. You can make the choice to move on, and it's not necessarily because the employer did anything wrong, it's just because it doesn't work for you and what you need.
So that sort of gets back to where we started, which is, these policies need to navigate between enforcing sort of basic standards of decent behavior and going one step maybe too far and having people sign a love contract.
And organizations do that, and they can.
All right.
I hate it when they do that, because I really don't want to know. Be frank.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for a great discussion. And now let's open up questions to the audience. Yes, and if you could stand so we can all hear you.
I'd like to learn a little bit more about is her and what's going on in Canada, creating laws to make it against the law for me to call her a him or by mistake even, and then specifically to bathrooms.
So I won't answer any of that legal portion of this, but I'll tell you what our experience has been. Previously I worked for a very large government employer, and an issue did come up with a transgendered individual, and a group of people were very unhappy that the transgendered individual was using the restroom that was identified as the gender that they transitioned to. Okay, so they just didn't think it was right. The easy solve is non-gender-specific restrooms. That's it. And almost every medical facility that you walk into these days has both pictures outside of every restroom door. That's very purposeful. Because they don't want to fight you're not going to fight that battle. Don't.
Not multi-stall.
If there's multiple stalls in the same restroom, why does it matter? And this is one of those, it's a sensitivity that people lose over time. And I gotta tell you, when the solution that we put on the table, and the union was involved in this matter, because it was a grievance, of all things, how do you grieve restroom use? But anyways, you have the union sitting there, and we said our solve to this is every restroom in this facility will be non-gender specific. And every single restroom did happen to have stalls in it. That's how this particular building was put together, so it worked just fine. No issue. Everybody had to swallow a little bit and move on with that one, but it is a solution that works. Usually not the answer they're after, but it's a solution.
There was a recent claim with regards to an employee, a transgendered employee, and he wasn't allowed to use the restroom closest to his cubicle area. He had to go clear around the building to use the restroom every single time, and he ended up getting terminated because he wasn't effectively working, and there was a huge discrimination claim that came about because of it. So it's important to be cognizant of those individuals and at least helping them to make it a little easier, especially with restrooms.
If you have an opportunity to put in a single stall, non-gender specific restroom, that is a great solution. This is one of those areas where the law, I mean, it takes some time for the law to catch up with what people are already understanding as reality or a norm. And that's what's happening here. We're starting to see cases that are very specifically tying use of the wrong pronoun, the way that people are being treated based on their gender identity in a way that we haven't seen before. And at some point, those are going to make their way up to the courts of appeal and to the Supreme Court, but it takes some time. You don't want to be the test market for that case. You don't want to be the case that ends up on everybody's radar setting the new definitions of harassment for gender identity. I do think it's clear that there's enough out there now that gender identity is covered, at least it's covered under Oregon law, probably soon to be covered under federal law. And states are kind of gaining steam in that direction. But if somebody has a pronoun preference, use it. If they want to be called they rather than he or she, use it. That person also needs to understand that it might take some time to catch up and be sensitive to that issue, that not everybody is used to calling a single person by what we customarily think of as a plural pronoun. They give us time to catch up to them. We do our best to meet them where they are, and everybody's happy.
What about those that kind of flip
Back and forth?
back and forth?
Meaning
And,
what?
you don't know whether it's going to be he or she is going to be a male or a female that day.
I think you asked the question, how would you like to be addressed? I mean, most of us have seen now emails coming from our clients or from other people that say, Haley Morrison, Tonkon Torp, direct dial, blah, 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 preferred pronoun. Some of those, that's becoming more regular with a lot of our bigger clients that are just defining it for themselves. But if you have a workplace where that's an issue, just ask them. And ask, does this change depend on how you are presenting today, or would you always like to be called he?
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah, our organization is about 100 employees, so I'm just the sole HR person, and you were talking about training earlier, and that's something that, as I've just gradually moved into HR from accounting and things like that, not really sure where the best place to start is. Do you have recommendations on organizations or means of getting just really good basic training in this type of thing?
Are you talking about training for the employee base or for?
I guess for myself as human resources to, eventually distribute that to managers or maybe bring managers along and then distribute that information throughout the organization.
Sure. I don't know if everybody heard, but the question was related to training for employees and for HR. Her organization's about 100 people. So what are the resources?
We do that work.
There are a lot of HR outsourcing outfits that can do it. There's a lot of resources online, which, as we talked about a little earlier, is maybe not the most effective. But if you're doing it coming from accounting to HR and you don't know a lot about some particular topic, that's a great one as an individual person to invest in. For employee populations more generally, there are a lot of HR outfits. Your lawyers can always do it. We're usually more expensive. But there are, and depending on what you're looking for, if you are looking for, one of my colleagues right now is at one of our new clients she's doing a full day seminar 5 different times for their population so they can have small group roundtables. I think that is really wisely led by an attorney so that she can handle a lot of those very particular questions that they need to have answered in that format. If you're looking for general harassment discrimination training, there are a lot of resources like HR Answers and that you can bring in.
I would check with your insurance carrier as well. A lot of times they'll have training available for free.
Yep. Make sure that if you are going to bring training in-house, there's a couple markers of good training here. Employee-specific training, supervisory training, because there's a difference.
Major difference.
You got to cover them both. So even if it's whole group for one period of time and then we stay with just the supervisors for a period of time, and that the person invests enough time that they're evaluating your policies so that they can speak to what your organization has chosen to do, not just what could be done. You want some practical application built into that. Because it doesn't mean anything if all we talk about is, well, the federal law says and the state law says. That doesn't help. Make it personalized. So, but you got to get both employee and supervisor training.
They are very, very different.
Yep.
Well, Lori, earlier you said that employment was not a finality. It's not, an absolute. And training, I'm guessing, is the same thing, right? It's ongoing.
Absolutely.
You tailor the training depending on, your employee base at any given time. Yes. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
It's a question / comment. A number of times you guys have all said that employees have the option of leaving their jobs, and I agree. Flip side is, there's a whole host of people in the workforce who don't feel the confidence or don't have the skill sets that they can just up and walk away from their job, that they can just, and so that doesn't really sit right with me to just say, well, just quit your job. You're getting harassed. Get out. So I just, it's a poor comment. I just think that needs to be part of how we think about this. So it's like not everybody is empowered or able to just walk away or to even consider that as an option.
I think that was, oh, sorry.
They really need that job.
I think the choice of leaving your employer has to do more with what you were saying, Lori, was the love contract thing, not so much the harassment piece of it.
I don't think any of us intend to infer that that is the solve to harassment. It is in a situation where you are making a choice about something that would be a discretionary choice about what the employer has decided their policy is going to be. If that doesn't work for you, the option may be to leave. If you cannot leave, you do have to accept the fact that the organization has made some choices about how they're going to operate. And every organization is different. And I certainly appreciate the fact that there are individuals who, because of skill or any number of things, are stuck as far as they're concerned. That does not mean, outside of legal requirements, that the employer has to change anything. And I think it's just making sure that people maintain the balance of, you're making a choice to stay for reasons that the employer has no responsibility for.
Right. I think that you make a very, very important point to clarify that if there's something in the environment that is unsafe, unhealthy, hostile, that is the employer's responsibility to fix. If the employee, taking it completely out of the context of what we're talking about, if there is a no cell phone at work policy, but I like to text with my husband while I'm at work, I get to choose whether or not I'm going to abide by that policy, which is my obligation, or I'm going to go somewhere else. In no way, shape, or form did we mean to suggest that somebody should just leave because they're being retaliated against, mistreated. But you do have to abide by employer policies when they are fair and reasonable.
All right. Yes.
I just had a comment. I went to a seminar with probably 500 people in the room, and we were talking about the multi-generational, and they were actually surveying, asking questions about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in the workplace. And I thought, I can't imagine that it would be generational. But when they did it, it was, is it okay to go to lunch with a opposite sex worker? Is it okay to go to dinner? Is it okay to have a drink? Is it okay to have a relationship with a coworker? Is it okay to have a relationship with a manager? And it's so interesting that the younger generations think that all that's okay.
Yeah.
And whereas as it gets older, they think it's less and less okay, not surprisingly. But they're also, the millennials are also the ones that are going to, or again, what they're going to do is stand up and say this is wrong. So it's hard to say, yeah, it's okay if we do, but then we're going to be the ones to say it's wrong if something happens. So I think this multi-generational thing is more than we think it out to be. We have to define the laws, the company policies based on the most conservative, I believe. I don't think you can say, yes, it's okay, because sometimes people can't manage themselves in those environments.
Yep, and that goes back to your company culture as well.
And then the second thing, my question is, we're hearing a lot of news in the news about, oh, this happened 10 years, me too, and this happened 10 years ago. And I had a female employee come to me and say, I was harassed 10 years ago by a manager who's no longer at our company. And, I think to say, well, that doesn't matter because it's so long ago, it's wrong. You have to say, I'm sorry that happened, I'm sorry you didn't bring it to our attention at the time, that person is no longer here, blah, blah, blah. But define, what we're seeing in the news, all the stuff about so long ago versus statute. Maybe they don't have legal liability as a company, but they still have cultural liability. How do you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and we are seeing so much of that. I have an employee that was brought to my attention from one of my clients recently where this incident happened 30 years ago. And they've been hanging on to it, and they're still mad. And they never brought it to our attention before then. But this goes back to listening and making somebody feel heard. So as a company, you have no legal responsibility in that vein anymore. If it's a former manager, that manager's gone. As a matter of law, there's no statute of limitations that's ever going to apply. So you could blow them off. But then what do you have? An angry employee that's going to find another reason to be angry with you, not productive, etc. So really the obligation there is not so much from a legal perspective, it's more just the human connection where you just say, like you said, I am so sorry that happened to you. Had we had known about it, we could have taken proactive steps, but what can we do to help you now? Is there something that is in your environment now that is reminding you of the situation, or that is ongoing, or it's a cultural problem? Is there something now that we can do to address the situation that happened many years ago? And sometimes what you find out is that it's really the culture that persists, and that's what's upsetting the employee as opposed to the particular person that they're upset about. And the situation, the 30-year-old situation that I'm dealing with now, what I'm finding is that the employee is very bothered about that thing that happened 30 years ago, but more bothered about the fact that it still permeates the culture with other people. And it felt like it was an unaddressed issue that follows her. So I think it's just having those conversations and understanding if there's something that you can do other than saying, gosh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. If anything happens now, please feel free to come and talk to me. Now that you've done it once, I have an open door and I'm going to listen.
And if you don't do that, you risk reputational damage. So that's something to think about.
That is also another point, is for a lot of this Me Too movement, it's not really the legal liability that people are concerned about. It's reputational, it's solidarity, it's media attention, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, there's people that want to expose the notion that there are companies or areas of the country or whatever that are not treating people appropriately. So that media attention is really meant to bring about change, even though it might feel like it's an attention-seeking thing. A lot of times it really is meant to bring positive change. And so you may not have any legal liability at all, but you certainly don't want that person, calling KGW and saying this happened at this company and they don't care.
Yep.
It is interesting. I think the original Me Too cases focused on incidents that happened 20 years ago, and it was those cases that brought attention to the cultural challenge we face today. So
get the Bill Cosby that all happened many years ago. I mean, I think sometimes this situation I was just talking about, the employer couldn't understand why this employee is hanging on to it and why they didn't bring it forward earlier. And her explanation was that she didn't feel strong enough. But because of the Me Too movement and other things, she's saying, you know what, I don't want this to happen anymore, so I'm going to bring it up. And sometimes it really takes that distance and time for somebody to be able to feel comfortable speaking up. So we take them where they are.
And my final part of that was, like, we're hearing settlement agreements are not being held to, enforced. So what do we do as employers?
You can. I mean, if you have a if you have a confidential, this is kind of a two-part question. If you have a confidentiality agreement that's not being enforced, you can go after the employee, decide the risk-benefit analysis of doing that. Sometimes the cat's already out of the bag, the bell's been rung. Going after that employee is only going to cause worse publicity, worse problems. But that's a decision to make as a business. Sometimes you do it so that other people don't also breach their agreements. The second part of that is with the tax code, the new legislation that doesn't allow you as a company to deduct the cost of a settlement if it is harassment related and has a confidentiality provision. And the notion behind that is that it's kind of the Bill O'Reilly problem, right? There's so many settlement agreements, they all had confidentiality provisions, so nobody knew what was really happening. So in the new tax code, if you want to settle a harassment claim, you either don't get the deduction and get a confidentiality provision, or you get the deduction but no confidentiality, meaning that people are free to talk about it.
All right. We have time for one or two more questions. Yes.
So if your company does not have a policy like what Intel has, and as a manager you see or hear about a relationship arising on your team that's either troubling or disruptive, what latitude, not having that policy, what latitude as a manager do you have in addressing it?
I think it's more of a cautionary note for those individuals, which is, while we don't have any policy that says this cannot happen, we know that it's all good till it's not. And many of us have experienced that, and even just in our personal relationships. Infrequently do we date one person and marry that person, and so on and so forth. It's all good till it's not. So if this is something that becomes an impact to the work environment, we may need to have further discussions. So please just moderate your relationship. I mean, there isn't much more, but to say, I know it's going on, and it may cause an issue. Go all about your work, please.
Yeah, I would echo that. Where you are going to run into trouble is if that relationship does start to permeate the workplace and you have to make a decision about either separating them, removing them, demoting somebody, or firing one or both. How you navigate that choice. And sometimes those are conversations that you might want to have up front, which is, we don't have a policy related to this, it's fine, you're a manager and subordinate, but here's what's going to happen. The manager's going to go if it becomes a problem. Male or female, make it articulable as to what the consequences can be, so that what's not happening is that you fire the female because you tossed the coin, and now you've got a discrimination charge or harassment charge. So I would have some upfront conversation, and then say, hope everything goes great, but if it starts to affect the work environment, this is what we anticipate the result would be. And sometimes the best result is that you both have to go.
And I'm going to close out then with one final question, just about your own workplace. To what extent have the events of the past year, it's been 2 years now since Me Too got underway, to what extent have those events really reshaped your careers and the work that you do?
Like internal within our workplaces, or the work we're seeing?
The work you are seeing.
Oh gosh.
For insurance, it's setting the expectation to our clients as far as rates are going up. Claims are coming in every single day. There was a claim back in December that settled for over $90 million for D&O directors and officers, but it was a harassment claim. So just to be educating our clients as to what to expect in the future, and make sure that they have all of the policies and procedures in place to show the underwriters at the end of the day, hey, this is what we're doing to prevent this, and we want to keep our rates as low as possible.
In my career, I've seen this very interesting cycle. When I first entered the profession, it was the phasing out of discrimination harassment claims. We always have some, but the main claims we were getting were wage and hour stuff. Because the law had already been set, people were more or less complying, and that just kind of stopped being the lawsuit du jour, and now it's just a complete spike. And a lot of what we are seeing is people that are speaking out about things that they've felt in the past, as opposed to new situations, and companies just being almost paralyzed by their caution, and trying to navigate a really tough line. We also see a lot of executives that are calling that are saying, I was fired for no reason, or what they perceive as being no reason, because XYZ was totally fine up until the Me Too movement, and now suddenly I've been fired for cause. I didn't do anything. So there's certainly some settling that's going to happen of the way these things are being looked at.
All right, thank you.
I think for HR Answers, it is somewhat of a pendulum swing is what we've experienced. It's been a topic. It's a topic again. One of our services is unlimited email and phone consultation. So we track what those calls are about. And there's been a lot of discussion about harassment. And it's HR professionals calling and saying our organization has let this get a little stale. We need to get it back into our normal everyday discussions. How do we do that? What's the advice you have? We haven't looked at our policy in umpty 9 years. We want to make sure it's fresh, that people can understand it, and getting them more information. We're invited to more things like this again, because people want good information about it. And that's the thing I say over and over again. You have access to information. Please make sure it's good. Please make sure it's good. So use the people that are professionally able to do that. Any attorneys, insurance agents, so on and so forth. This is part of their work. This is how they do it. Use them. Going to your neighbor is probably not the right thing if they own a landscape company. They may have experienced it, but that doesn't mean they should advise on it. So just get good information.
The other thing we're really seeing a trend in, both in the law and with some of our clients, is the notion of implicit bias, and not the intentional discrimination and harassment type of conversations that we've seen before. How do we have a diversity initiative? How do we make sure that people's reviews are accurate and are not tarnished or swayed by implicit bias, which, those reactions that we have that are involuntary, subconscious, and how to correct for some of that stuff. Because there are a lot of companies out there that have the best intentions, and they hire the most qualified people every single time and promote the best people, and then they look around and they say, upper management's all white men. How is that possible when we have these great diversity initiatives, when we're hiring even numbers of minorities and women? That, I think, is, especially with the fair pay stuff that's really coming up, the surveying of the workplace and taking a snapshot and saying, are we doing well enough in our hiring and promotion practices? Or if somebody were to sue us tomorrow, is it going to be clear that we don't have a minority employee in our workforce?
All right. Well, thanks for the good information. And that brings our panel discussion to a close. I want to let everyone in the room know that a recap of this event will appear in our July-August issue. And you can go to our website, OregonBusiness.com, to read that online, or you can subscribe to the magazine if you have not already subscribed. I want to thank the Partners Group, Tonkon, Torp, and HR Answers for participating in the panel today. This is a transitional moment in our culture and in the workplace, and as our panelists so eloquently put it, on the one hand, the issues that we are seeing come to the fore are emboldening employees and emboldening and empowering employees, and on the other hand, they present some very challenging situations for employers. So thank you again for being here.